Hello again, and welcome to again the reading of a journey. Well, this is the second episode that we've done today. A little earlier, we did chapter 10, Go West, Young Man, and I told you then that I'd be making falafel for dinner, which we did have, and it was pretty yummy. So, unfortunately, by the time this tape comes out tomorrow, it'll be too late for you to drop by for leftovers, so sorry about that. But if you do drop by sometime, we could probably make that happen. Um, I also mentioned to you Ruka's big adventure when we were out walking in the woods, and I thought she was lost. Um, Ruka's already down in bed along with my wife Carol. But if you were to go to www.ajourneythebook.com, you could see some pictures of Ruka. She's a very good doggy. Um, also on that site, um, there's a little blog sort of deal that it's called Random Thoughts, and if you ever look at that, don't hesitate to add some random thoughts of your own. That would really be cool to have a little interaction. And what else? Oh, also, there's a link to all the YouTube videos. If you ever felt like you just couldn't live without watching a YouTube video of the reading of a journey. But in the meantime, we're on chapter 11, entitled 33rd and South Sawyer. After returning to Washington State, I was very fortunate to be able to obtain a job working for my brother Mike. Brother Michael had retired from the modern home decor slash head shop industry, and together with his new business partner Larry, purchased the auction house from my folks. Mike and Larry had decided to phase out the auction side of the business and were concentrating on the sale of home furnishings. Because there were several apartments and condos being constructed at that time, they found themselves furnishing many of these new complexes. Much of my work revolved around driving truck, delivering, and setting up furniture. It was actually kind of a fun job. And everybody should learn how to navigate a big, fully loaded furniture truck with very questionable brakes throughout the streets of Tacoma and the surrounding area. I learned how to creatively downshift while also using the emergency brake in order to come to a stop. Before beginning the job with Michael, I first wanted to check out an opportunity that I understood might be available on the eastern side of the state. An opportunity that I never even thought about until having picked grapes at the Vendange. Washington enjoys a diverse agricultural industry that, among other crops, includes apples, wheat, cherries, pears, and an ever growing production of hops. And speaking of hops, wasn't it Benjamin Franklin who said, "Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy"? Even though there are lots of t shirts out there, and I have one, that would lead you to believe that he did, he really didn't. Oh well, at any rate, Washington grows a whole lot of hops. It wasn't hops, though, that I was interested in at that time, but rather cherries. It was cherry season in eastern Washington, and it seemed very reasonable that if I could find a job picking grapes in France, I should be able to find a job picking cherries in the state of Washington where I grew up. I was wrong. It turned out to be much more difficult than anticipated. I hitchhiked over the Cascade Mountain Pass to eastern Washington, and after a quick stop to visit my brother Frank and his family, Frankie was a state patrolman living in the college town of Ellensburg at that time, I moved on to an area known for its cherry orchards. It wasn't until being told that there was no need for my mad fruit picking skills by about three orchard owners that one kindly orchardist, who probably felt sorry for me, did offer a place to pitch my tent, a ladder, and a picker's bucket to put the cherries in. There wasn't going to be much money made, but the weather was beautiful, and the cherries were delicious. I ate a lot of them. There was even a crystal clear irrigation ditch running through the orchard that provided a great place for a cool dip. That is, until after a day or two, when the owner advised me to be very careful about rattlesnakes and to be sure not to swim in the irrigation ditch because it contained pesticides. Nice. Of course, I didn't receive that piece of information until after having already splashed around a couple times and soaked up a little organophosphate poison. Oh well, no harm done, although my hair all fell out and there was that nasty rash. Just kidding. The reason I had such a hard time finding a cherry picking job was because there were literally professional pickers that had come from Mexico for the harvest. Why hire a novice like me when there were all kinds of folks, many who probably came back to the same orchards every year, to do the work and to do it very efficiently? Also, it turns out I had come a little late in the season, so there were only a few days of picking left at the orchard I was on. After finishing up, I didn't even bother trying to find another harvest job, especially considering how hard it was to find the one I'd been given. Instead, I headed back to Western Washington and began my career as a furniture deliverer. As much as I needed a job, I also needed a place to live. Fortunately for me, in those days, it was possible to find a fairly cheap place to rent without having to provide all kinds of references and financial information. Perhaps it had something to do with the kind of place I was trying to rent. Rather than fairly cheap, very cheap would be more accurate. Mom and Dad were extremely nice to let me stay in their spare room for a short time, but with the understanding that I would soon be on my way. And hence, a new chapter of life in the house on 33rd and South Sawyer in Tacoma. What a great little house. It was easy to see how this had once been a very nice neighborhood. We even had a little corner store where you could pay way more for whatever you bought than you would anywhere else. I did occasionally buy some things there because I was pretty sure that it was hard for them to make ends meet, and because it was just very cool to have a little corner store. I think they were robbed at least once, maybe twice, while I lived there. My excellent little house had an enclosed front porch, a small back porch, a couple fruit trees in the backyard, a clawfoot bathtub, and a picket fence. It was awesome. After painting the fence white and facing the front of the porch with cedar shakes, it was even more cool. I'm sure that there had once been several more places like mine in the hood, but they'd been replaced with apartment houses. In the apartment house next door lived my friend Tyrone. Tyrone was a large black man who looked like he could have been a professional football player. He lived with his wife and little boy. Tyrone had recently been released from Walla Walla Penitentiary for something to do with prostitution. Evidently, he'd been a pimp. Tyrone was a great neighbor. Each week he would borrow my trusty Schwinn bicycle to make his visits with a probation officer. In return, I always knew that he would be keeping an eye on my place when I was away. I seldom even locked my door. Tyrone and I did become friends. Once, while paying a little visit and looking over some of my photographs of Europe, Tyrone pulled out a joint of what he called mint leaf. Although I didn't know what it was, I figured it was at least an herb of some kind. It really didn't matter what kind of herb it was because it turned out to be laced with a very horrible drug called PCP. PCP, or what's also known as angel dust, was the stuff that you read reports about of people jumping off roofs after taking it, thinking they could fly, or some other insane thing that bad stories are made of. I think it was after a couple tokes when Tyrone decided to divulge that the herb we were smoking may have contained a little something extra. I didn't smoke any more, but had already had enough to become incredibly paranoid and to start obsessing about all the nasty things I thought might happen. Fortunately, the effects, although very weird, weren't quite as terrible as anticipated. Still, there was nothing angelic about angel dust. Excuse me. I'll try not to cough during this. My friend Tyrone's mom and dad were in the process of moving from one location to another, and because I was driving a pickup truck at the time, Tyrone asked if I could help them make the move. I remember driving with a truckload of household stuff along with Tyrone, his mom and dad, and me all squished into the front of the truck. Tyrone was a big guy, and his mom and dad were pretty full grown as well, so it was a tight squeeze. Tyrone's dad opened up a little cardboard box that was filled with bottles of prescription cough syrup. He passed one around and said it was his favorite brand. I didn't ask where he got it. Other than Tyrone and his wife, I didn't get to know too many of my neighbors. I did, however, get to know at least a little the very nice elderly Polish woman and her husband who lived across the street. I can imagine they lived in that neighborhood for many years. We met after a UPS driver decided to leave a box on my front porch that actually belonged to them. It was surprising to me that my nice neighbor would be so completely astonished when I brought them over their package. Surprising and sad. There apparently hadn't been a lot of love thy neighbor happening in that neighborhood for a while. So here I was, living in the little house on South Sawyer and working for Michael doing a job that I enjoyed. And to make things even better, there was Nicholas. Nicholas was a great rescue cat that somebody, I can't remember who it was now, asked me to take care of. He really was a great cat. Sometimes I didn't have official cat food at the house, so Nicholas would eat whatever I was having. He reminded me of the dog named Ash in Cognac, France, the one that liked to eat fruits and nuts. Among other things, Nicholas enjoyed lettuce and pineapple. All in all, and practically speaking, life on South Sawyer was good. Good, except for that place in my spirit that just wasn't being satisfied. I'd come to find out that simply trying to do the right things under my own power wasn't going to fill the void. I was also pretty sure, however, that doing anything and everything I chose, whether I thought it was right or wrong, also certainly wasn't fulfilling my spiritual needs. I was confused. And so the journey continued. The mid and later 70s brought with them two very powerful and undeniable phenomena: disco music and cocaine. I'm happy to say that I was able to resist the siren song of groups like Casey and the Sunshine Band and the Bee Gees. Perhaps if I'd been someone who enjoyed disco dancing, things would have been different. At the time, though, I was one of those disco sucks kind of people. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to resist the call of cocaine. Particularly during the time I was working for Michael, cocaine was a very popular, and if you had the money to pay for it, available drug. Of the variety of drugs that I tried in my foolish youth, I believe that cocaine may have been the worst. With most recreational drugs, at least in my experience, you expected some kind of mind-altering effect from the substance you took. You knew, though, that what you were experiencing was not real. It wasn't real life. The mind was being altered. Cocaine, on the other hand, had a subtle way of making you think that the hyper-exaggerated confidence it was producing was the real you. Its effects included this very false confidence and the sense that you were way more on top of things than you really were. I'm guessing this would attribute to why so many people found themselves addicted to it. I saw more than a few people whose lives and whose families' lives were very profoundly and very negatively impacted by the abuse of cocaine. Fortunately, although I did use Coke, I never had enough money to make it a regular part of my life. For that, I'm grateful. But never fear, I did manage to mess up my head with plenty of other things. Knowing that many people were and even today are huge fans of disco music, I really would like to take this opportunity to say something positive about it. I'm sorry, I just can't. Disco sucks. Probably because it's such a beautiful part of the world, many of my friends from school ended up remaining in the Pacific Northwest. One of those friends was my good buddy, who, for anonymity's sake, we will call Roy. I guess we could call him Ronaldo or Rizwan or maybe Ruben. No, let's call him Roy. Roy was someone I'd known and been friends with since junior high. We both worked for my dad back in the auction house days, and we were now both working for Brother Michael at the furniture store. I can never forget the time, probably around our junior year in high school, when Roy and I were hanging out in the parking lot of the local Herfy's Burger joint. With us was our good bud, who also, for anonymity's sake, we'll call Larry. When the three of us got together, it was frequently part of our agenda to smoke a little pot. Such was the case that day at Herfy's. I'm guessing the local police officer, who also happened to be hanging at Herfy's, must have seen the smoke coming from the windows of Roy's Volkswagen van. He walked up to the bus, which the three of us were now standing outside of, and asked, "So what's that funny smell?" Roy, who was someone who could always come up with a ready reply, simply said, "Dead fish." The officer then started looking around the front of Roy's van and noticed a little wooden club that was sticking out from under the front seat and asked, "So what's that for?" I think just about every young lad that took woodshop in junior high made a little wooden club on the lathe as one of their projects. Some of the more resourceful even drilled out the center and filled it with lead. Many of those little clubs later ended up under the front seat of that young man's car. Roy replied, and with a straight face, mind you, "It's what we use to kill the fish." I'm not sure if the officer was amused or not, but at any rate, he decided not to pursue that funny smell. Good old Roy. Thinking back on the day at Herfy's with Roy, Larry, and the dead fish, I'm also reminded of the summer before our sophomore year of high school, when Larry and I embarked on a pretty epic bicycle trip. At least it was epic for two 15 or 16-year-old kids. We strapped backpacks onto our Schwinn 10 speeds and headed out from our homes in Lakewood, Washington, across the Narrows Bridge, north up the Kitsap Peninsula, over the Hood Canal Bridge, and across the Olympic Peninsula to Port Angeles. Along the way, we stopped to spend the night at a campground outside of the town of Sequim, where I got stung by a bee on the forehead. I remember being kind of scared when I looked into the mirror, and also remember Larry thinking it was really funny when my forehead swelled up like a Neanderthal man proportions. No worries, after a shot of Benadryl from a local doc, and after a good night's sleep, which the shot of Benadryl guaranteed, all was back to normal. From Port Angeles, which was probably 110 miles or so from Lakewood, we took a boat to Victoria on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and camped for a couple days. Now, I wasn't going to include this little story, but as they say, confession is good for the soul. While on the island, my friend, who for anonymity's sake we will call Larry, and I had breakfast in a pancake restaurant. After finishing his food, my friend, who for anonymity's sake we'll call Larry, excused himself to go to the bathroom. Surprise, he never came back. My friend, Larry, had dined and dashed. So now I had to decide if I would make the same decision and slip out the back door like my friend did, or would I simply pay for both of our meals? Sorry to say, I chose the low road. I excused myself to go to the bathroom. From Victoria, we rode to Sydney, and from there took a ferry to Friday Harbor on San Juan Island. That night, we stayed with a cousin of mine who lived outside of Friday Harbor and even enjoyed some awesome fish and chips made with fresh cod that we'd caught right off the rocks. The next morning, Larry and I started our return trip home, taking the same route we had come. I'm thinking it must have been about a 275-mile bike trip, plus the boat sailings. If you'll excuse me, I've got to wet my throat. All right. Okay. Pretty awesome trip for a couple young teenagers. That last night on the way home, we pulled into a park near the Hood Canal Bridge. It was late, it was dark, it was rainy, and we weren't real excited about trying to set up the tent. Instead, we found that if you threw a plastic tarp down on the floor of the shower room, it made a pretty good place to sleep. We also found that if both of us held the door shut with our feet, the guy who wanted to take a shower in the middle of the night would finally go away. We left early the next morning, thus avoiding having to pay for the night, and made the final 50-plus mile leg of our journey. Like I said, it was a pretty awesome trip for a couple young guys. Come to think of it, Larry and I experienced a few memorable escapades together. On one occasion, the two of us were invited to join our friend, who for anonymity's sake we'll call Terry, on a very unique adventure. Terry, who I'm almost positive didn't actually possess a driver's license yet, would sometimes work for his uncle by driving a big septic truck and pumping out the portable latrines that were found at various public places where portable latrines needed to be pumped out. On this particular occasion, Terry was going out to the drag races where, because he was driving the truck, he would supposedly be emptying the latrines and would get in for free. The three of us went to the track and did get in for free and did get to watch both the drag races and the motorcycle races. Lo and behold, we never did manage to pump out any latrines. It just so happened that we made this little trip on a day during what was called Senior Week at our high school. During that week, it was customary for seniors to find some unsuspecting sophomores and throw them off the bridge that spans Stillicum Lake. The three of us determined that rather than allow ourselves to be victims of Senior Week, we would instead take advantage of the fact that we were driving around in a giant poop truck with a hose that could be used not only to suck out latrines, but also to spray doo-doo on seniors intent on throwing us off the bridge. We even cruised Herfies in the truck, looking for any senior weekers who might be so inclined. Fortunately, we never came across any. I'm not sure if we'd have been bold enough to pull out the poop hose or not. Probably not. And now, as I'm thinking about some of the great friends I was privileged to know in high school, it would be a shame not to mention Carl and Jerry. It would also be a shame not to mention our little late-night art project. I really was fortunate in my youth and young adulthood to know some great people who became really good friends in school. One of those was Carl. Carl was the son of an Iranian mother and a Norwegian father. It was always a fun cultural experience to go to his house. And Carl owned a very cool '56 Chevy. Jerry was a guy who always seemed to have a smile on his face. You always felt like he was genuinely happy to see you. As a result, it was always a pleasure to see him. I got to spend a little time with both Carl and Jerry in 2015 at our 40th high school reunion. It truly was a pleasure to see both of those guys. Jerry looked like he just walked out of the Old Testament with his long hair and long beard, and he was still smiling. So one night, Carl, Jerry, and I, and come to think of it and not wanting to leave anybody out, there might have been a guy named Steve as well, felt incredibly motivated, nay, perhaps obligated, to do some painting and make some changes to a cigarette billboard. Looking out at, actually, it was two identical back to back billboards advertising cigs. Looking out at you from the signs and trying to sell you on the idea of buying his brand of smokes was the image of a hip guy with black hair and a thick black mustache. It was uncanny how by just lengthening the billboard man's hair to shoulder length, giving him a little beard, and adding a bit to his stash, he looked just like Frank Zappa. Somebody had to do this. Please know that I in no way condone defacing billboards, and very likely Frank Zappa would not have either. It was so classic, though. But I digress. Let us return to that time period when Roy and I were both working for my brother Mike. As already mentioned, this was becoming a confusing season in my life. Undoubtedly, some of that confusion was exacerbated by experimenting with drugs. On a few occasions, Roy and I chose to experiment together. Roy was living in a great little place just outside of Lakewood. One evening, while relaxing at his lakeside abode, we thought it might be fun to drop acid. It just so happened that on this particular evening, Roy had also scheduled a visit from a Kirby vacuum cleaner salesperson to come out and give a demonstration. That poor girl. I'm pretty sure the Kirby company never instructed their salespeople on how to give a presentation to a couple guys tripping on acid. She was a really good sport, though, and didn't even mind whipping the cord around a little so we could watch the tracers that it produced. Very early the next morning, Roy and I went to a nearby park to catch the sun coming up. It was a glorious sunrise. Interestingly, I remember feeling bad because I wasn't experiencing this beautiful sunrise as it really was. Instead, I was seeing it under the residual influence of a hit of acid from the night before. That bothered me. Go figure. I'm compelled to mention here that in those years of our youth, when Roy and I were horsing around together, although we most likely didn't make any huge contributions to the human race, we did develop a lifelong friendship that I'm very grateful for today. Between travels and marriages and families and life, we sort of lost touch with each other in the early 80s. We seldom, if ever, even spoke to each other for 20 years or so. Today, however, I consider Roy one of my closest compadres. We even manage to get together on occasion. I so appreciate that life still includes a few good old friends. It wasn't a total surprise when my folks gave a call to let me know that they had been contacted by a young man from New Zealand who was in Seattle and who was looking for me. It was Peter. He had found a job in London as planned and worked there until the autumn. He then started his trip back home to New Zealand by way of the USA. Excuse me. While in New York, he saw a sign at the bus station which read, "From anywhere in America to anywhere in America, $99. Peter went up to the count and said, "I'll have one of those from New York City to Vancouver, British Columbia." The clerk, in Peter's words, got difficult and told me Vancouver, BC was not in America. After about 15 minutes of arguing about the USA, the American continents, North and South, and then finally with the intervention of a supervisor, Peter got his ticket. 3 weeks later, he was calling from Seattle. The next day, he was staying at my place and also working along with me for my brother Mike. In addition to working for Michael, Peter and I were also offered a little weekend job from the manager of the grocery store where I had previously been employed. Our task was to clean out behind the trash compactor, which was located on the back side of the store. The compactor was a big machine that crushed all the grocery store garbage and then pushed it into a big storage tank. When the container was full, a semi-truck would replace it with an empty one. The thing is, all kinds of rotting, extremely foul-smelling, and very slimy grocery store garbage would manage to fall between the outside wall of the store and the storage container. Our fun job was to slip around in the sludge between the wall and the tank and clean it up. If I remember correctly, there was no shortage of nasty little flying bugs behind the compactor as well. Welcome to America, Peter. Between working in chicken houses in Israel and now this, Peter and I participated in a couple pretty funky jobs. I think the compactor cleanup did at least pay pretty well. You'd think our experience with devil's weed while in Israel would have been enough to curb any future drug adventures for Peter and me. It didn't. In Western Washington and in the 70s, you would sometimes see people wandering around the local cow fields and looking as if they were searching for something. They were likely looking for the little mushrooms that could be found popping up among the cow pies. These psilocybin, or magic mushrooms, were of the hallucinogenic kind. And they happened to be growing at the same time Peter was visiting. I'm not sure if we ate them or made tea or what. I do remember going to Point Defiance Zoo and having a conversation with the harbor seals. The seals started barking incessantly at us, and at the time, and in our mental state, Peter and I were both pretty sure that they knew we were high. They were probably begging for herring. Peter ended up spending a few weeks at my place, and in that time had a chance to see a little bit of the Great Northwest, save up enough money to continue his journey home, and talk to harbor seals. The last time I saw Peter, Brother Mike and I had dropped him off at a freeway on-ramp heading south on I-5 and wished him Godspeed. With multiple travels and jobs and address changes between us, Peter and I managed to totally lose touch of each other for over 35 years. About 3 months ago, I was so completely surprised when the phone rang, and guess who was calling from New Zealand? What a great and unexpected telephone call. Peter had recently been reminiscing about his time in Israel and was motivated to find out if Kibbutz Nachshon had a web page. They do, and the site also has a link where previous volunteers can post a little message. I had also found the Kibbutz webpage about 10 years ago and posted a message that included our home phone number. It was so incredibly cool to have a chance to reconnect with my old friend Peter. In the summer of 1978, and while still living on South Sawyer, my parents presented me with an interesting proposition. Mom and Dad were people who liked to stay active. Now that they no longer owned the auction house, something else was needed to occupy their time. To at least temporarily fill that void, they decided it might be fun to manage a little restaurant for a few months. Mom's sister June and her husband Glenn lived on the northernmost tip of the Kitsap Peninsula in the waterfront village of Hansville. They'd moved to the peninsula from Seattle in 1969 during the Boeing-triggered economic collapse after having purchased a salmon fishing resort that was located in Hansville's booming metropolis. If you know Hansville, you know there's no booming metropolis. So after 10 busy years of operating Forbes Landing, they were now in the process of selling the business. It was during this transition period that my folks agreed to manage the restaurant. They planned to expand the hours by adding a dinner service and expand the menu by adding, among other things, some very tasty steak and seafood selections. Dad really was a great self-taught chef, and Mom was an awesome baker. She made the most wonderful breads and pies and incredible cinnamon rolls, all of which would be included on the menu. I can almost smell the cinnamon rolls now that Mom would without fail bake for all of our family get-togethers. Mom and Dad's proposition was to have me join them for this little restaurant adventure. Although working at the furniture store had been a fine job for several months, and although the South Sawyer house had been a great place to live, I was starting to feel like a change of scenery might not be a bad idea. Also, the opportunity to work with my folks while at the same time living in a quaint little waterfront village for a while was a pretty nice thought. A few months prior, I'd taken out a car loan and purchased a very nice Volkswagen van that was all decked out for camping. With a loan to pay, I would have never been able to make the move with my folks, except that just prior to their offer, someone ran into me one morning on the way to work and the van was totaled. I was sorry to see it go, but the wreck did get me out from under the loan. I would so love, however, to have that van now. After submitting my notice of resignation to Michael, and after finding a replacement renter for the South Sawyer house, actually 2 co-workers from the furniture store took over occupancy, Nicholas and I set out for Hansville. And that concludes 33rd and South Sawyer. Next go around, we'll be looking at chapter 12, Not the Author of Confusion. And I think we're going to find the book sort of takes a shift at this point. So I'm looking forward to getting into this. Thank you. Always a pleasure. And until next time, adios.